Hello, everyone. Good to see you this morning on this wonderful Thursday. It is the 22nd of February in the year of our Lord 2024. What a tremendous time to be alive. And today we are going to be talking about something that I think is important due to the internet. And I just think it's worth talking about. I know I have touched on some of these things before. Really, what I would like to do is I would love to do a class on this because I just think it would be so helpful for a lot of you, and also to understand what is taught about the Bible in uh, higher education, seminaries, and in colleges and universities across the United States and probably across the world, at least the Western world. Because the Bible is, besides being a holy book, right, to us, which we treat as God's word, it also is something that is studied by all sorts of people, right? And this is important because this impacts our method, because a lot of these are really helpful. Some of the things that are said can be really helpful for determining all sorts of things about the Gospels, but at the same time, there are also stuff that is just picked up and used in media because it's seen to have a neutral or unbiased perspective, which I disagree with. I don't think anything is unbiased. I'm very postmodern in that way. But like if you were to watch a PBS special about the history of the church, chances are you're going to hear a lot of this, as opposed to, I guess, what has been traditionally taught or what we would believe about the Bible and things like that. So, and not all of this is bad. Again, I don't want to set up a dichotomy where you have to choose between one or the other. I think some of what we're going to talk about today is actually very helpful. But I want to talk about why it's important. And the reason I just want to ask you this question is, who do you believe wrote the first five books of the Bible, which is commonly called the Pentateuch, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah, as it is also called, right? The law or the teaching. Who wrote that? Now, if you were at any time in history, probably before the modern period, you would have said Moses, right? You would have said, well, Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Like that's who it traditionally has been attributed to. And this is true, actually. I have a Swedish Bible at home, which dates back to the 1800s and maybe early 1900s, like maybe like 1901 or something. And in that book, it has a preface to each. They're actually just they're not even called, at least in my Swedish version of the Bible, which might not be the normal one because it was printed in America for Swedish Americans, so it's for my family. That's why I have it. But they're not called Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy in Swedish. The first five books are just called the first book of Moses, the second book of Moses, the third, fourth, fifth book of Moses. I imagine that might be an oddity. I don't know. I haven't done enough research into it, but like there you see that's how they are identified in this Bible that my family has, dating back quite a while, right? So, like, why is this important? Well, it's important because that is not the scholarly consensus today, right? If you were to go to Rutgers and you were to take a Old Testament class, and they were to say, well, who wrote the book who wrote the Pentateuch? This is what you would see. Let me pull this up. We're gonna get to these things, but this is what you would see, right? This is the image that they would show you, and we're gonna talk about this. I'll explain what's going on here, but that's what's going on. Right? That's what they would teach you. They'd say, well, it's not Moses. It's these many people who wrote the Pentateuch, right? So we're gonna talk about that, and I just want to point out, like, just things that people have pointed out about the Pentateuch, and we're not going to go super into it. This is supposed to be an overview to get your feet wet, and hopefully we'll return to this in the future. I am going to talk about a lot of the hypotheses that are here, but I'm also going to point out to you my kind of problems with them. This isn't a full-throated rebuttal because I don't think all of critical scholarship is wrong, but I do think it has a bias, even though it claims not to. So first things first, though, right, is if we are going to talk about who wrote the Pentateuch, there are some interesting things, right, that kind of point that, well, Moses can't have written all of it, presumably because there's a whole chapter at the end of Deuteronomy devoted to the death of Moses, right? So it says in verse 5, right? Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. And then, of course, Joshua takes over and we head off into the historical books. But so here, right, like if Moses has written the Pentateuch, well, he can't have written this because he's dead, just as it goes, right? Now, maybe some people have proposed that he wrote it ahead of time and then died. I'm sure people have said that. There's been debate about this without Christian history. So Jerome, one of the first translators of the Old Testament into Latin, the first translator as far as I know, he believed that the Pentateuch wasn't written by Moses entirely. Martin Luther believed the same thing. I'm sure there are many other people who believe this throughout the centuries, right? That even if now they would say the majority of it was written by Moses, but there have to be parts that he couldn't have written. There's also a bunch of repetition in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. You have sometimes doubling of stories. So the best example of this is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Both are creation stories, but they don't line up with each other if you look at it closely, right? They have differences between each other, and this is why scholars believe that was actually written, or those are two different traditions that have been kind of edited together to talk about theological things, right? But like, can we deny entirely Mosaic authorship as Christians, right? Well, we're kind of in a bind, I believe, right? We have to understand these things in a lot more of a nuanced way because Jesus does, right? So this is from John 5:45. He says, he's telling people about who he is and that they need to believe in him. He says, but do not think I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom your hopes are set. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? So right there you have a reference by Jesus to the Pentateuch, right, to the Torah, talking about how Moses wrote it. This is something, now, secular scholars would just say, well, this is not Jesus. That's something that they would probably say. But even if it was, like, Jesus is a historical guy. He makes mistakes, right? He's not the Son of God. This is something that's important for us to reconcile, but it's easy if you just throw out the whole thing. But if you actually, like I do, believe that Jesus is Christ and God, like, well, it seems like he's saying Moses wrote the Pentateuch, so we should believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Now, this is not I think that you, again, can be nuanced with this. Because Jesus is using this to accuse the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other people. You know, is this him defending all of Mosaic authorship? Is that what this is primarily about? Not necessarily, but it definitely hints at Mosaic authorship for some of the Pentateuch, if nothing else. And then, of course, we have references to New Testament, right? Because we're also going to do a little bit of New Testament stuff today. We're going to do both. A little bit of both, not deep dives. We're going to stay at the surface and I'm going to give you the theories. But of course here, right, Luke in the beginning says that there are other things that he has seen besides the Gospels. And I'll show you, actually, a chart that shows where Luke kind of drew some of his information from. He says, this is in his introduction, he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So Luke here in the beginning is saying, well, I'm writing my gospel, and I've compiled all of these things, right? He's made an orderly account, if you keep reading, to present Theophilus the gospel of Luke, right? And Acts, they were part of they're probably one document. We separated them later, but they're kind of they're one thing, written by the same guy. So here we have references to other things. Now, why is this important? Like, why do we need to talk about this? Because this might not be of particular interest to you. Why does this matter? Well, the reason it matters is because people will use this scholarship in ways that is sometimes propagandistic to destroy or hurt the faith of Christians who have not been taught this stuff or haven't even been prepared with responses or an understanding of it. One of the best examples recently is this video, Satan's Guide to the Bible, which is an hour and 25 minutes and 51 seconds. And it has 900,000 views, came out a month ago, so I'm sure it's going to hit 1 million soon. Some Christians have responded to it and stuff like that, but one of the things I just want to point out is that I've watched parts of it. I'm not going to do a response. I honestly don't think it's that great. I think it's propaganda. I actually think there's some deceptive editing of some of the scholars in the video, who I know, or I shouldn't say know as in like friendly with, but I studied under them or am aware of some of their work. And I think if you are unprepared to hear these things, like, you will have no response. And so we have to be very clear about what we're teaching. And the whole point of this Satan's Guide is that their pastors are hiding this information from you, right? That's what they'll say. They'll say we're consistently hiding this information from our parishioners, and so I do not want to be charged with that, even though I think that that's wrong. I think there's a difference between hiding, right, that's kind of conspiratorial, and not believing and then not teaching, right, which is what happens most of the time. Because a lot of pastors are aware of this stuff, and they go, oh, okay, well, that kind of exists. I don't agree with it, so I'm not going to talk about it in my sermons. And then this video accuses us of hiding it. So I don't want to even give that idea that I'm hiding it. So I'm going to show you guys some of this scholarship that has been done on who wrote the Bible. And this whole field is called biblical textual criticism. So it's criticism of the text, not criticism in the way of attacking or anything like that in that way, although that can be a part of it as well. It mostly is involved in looking at the text through a critical lens, in the sense of finding like sources, finding the patterns, finding all this type of stuff. And we use this all the time, right? And there's Christian scholars who do this too, although it's slightly different than what we're going to see. So one of the first things that you'll learn if you go to take a New Testament course or an Old Testament course, they wouldn't call it that. So let's say you went to Rutgers, right? You would be taking a Hebrew Bible course, because Old Testament is a Christian term, right? So they'll call it the Hebrew Bible course. Or you'll take a New Testament course. And in these things, the first thing you're going to do, this is supposing you're at a secular university. I went to a secular university. I guess it technically wasn't, but it really was. It was like Lutheran, but not really, you know. So I went to a secular university where I was taught this stuff, and then I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, which is a mainline liberal Christian seminary, which also this textual criticism stuff is very important to liberal Christians. Again, that is not a political term, that is a theological term. I think I've talked about liberal Christianity before. If not, just Google it, you'll see, and you're going to see that there's a connection very clear, because they're drawing from 19th and 17th century scholarship on the Bible to say a lot of what they're saying. So all that is just I've been raised in this. This is something I believed. Like, this is like, I became a Christian very early on, like late high school, early, I would say I've always been, but I really started to take my faith seriously. That's kind of when my baptism was confirmed, if you want to say, in 17 and 18. And this was how I was, like, early on. So depending on how you calculate it, I considered myself a Christian, but I was more of like an Arian, really looking back on it. And if you don't know what Arian Christianity is, you have to look that up too. But sorry, I can't go through all this stuff now. So anyway, you're in the class. The first thing they're going to talk about is who wrote these books and when they were written. So I want to explain this chart to you, because this is what is called the documentary hypothesis. And this has actually been grown quite a bit. Basically, this is a argument about who wrote the Torah, right? So I'm going to explain what all of these letters mean. So first of all of this I'm going to try and explain what all these letters means. This is updated from what I've learned, because over the decades, they've consistently added new ways of qualifying it. And that's because the theory is kind of falling apart. Because what was once a easy way to categorize things has realized that, well, there's not much of a basis in doing this outside of just conjecture, and so people have begun just conjecturing all sorts of things. But I'm going to tell you what I learned. So it's called the four source hypothesis because there are considered four sources for the Pentateuch. The Yahwist, who focuses a lot and uses phrases that refer to God as Yahweh, versus the Elohist, who is the Elohim, right? The guy who refers to God as Elohim. Textual criticism relies on looking at words, right? Who uses them, assuming that one author will only use this type of language, right? I think it's wrong, but whatever the case. So, Yahwist, Elohist, and then there's the priestly source. That's the P. That's down here, the asterisk next to it. And then there's the Deuteronomist. And here, so it's J, E, D, and P. That's how I learned it. And here you can actually see, I don't know what R stands for. It says redactor. So I guess in the key down here, that the redactor is someone who came in later and changed things to make it flow better. Again, we'll talk about the problems with this, but that's at least maybe what you would be taught. And then you have the Deuteronomist 1 and Deuteronomist 2, so that there's at least two people who they believe contributed to Deuteronomy, and then Deuteronomy becomes part of the Torah, but also whoever wrote that also probably wrote some of the history books that we get later. And the reason that they push this is, again, a language game, right? So they're saying, well, some things seem to be concerned with this and have these words repeating, so it has to be this type of author that's doing it. And there is truth to that, right? There's like the fact that in Genesis 1, and I don't think I could be wrong on this, but Genesis 1 mainly just uses Elohim for the creation narrative, right? And then Genesis 2 uses Yahweh for the creation narrative, right? The Lord. So, how do you... So right there, right, people would say, well, this is written by one person, this is written by another. Not an entirely bad argument on the surface, right? But that's the kind of thing they do. And I actually remember in my college, we had a Bible in the library where you could open it up and it would mark every single section that scholars think was written by this person. And you can do this with all sorts of books. This is just the Pentateuch, right? You should see... I don't have it, and I don't know if I'll be able to find it online, but you should see how people divide up Isaiah. So there are all sorts of people who divide Isaiah from everywhere from one author to like 5+ different people, and they have really intricate ways of trying to show that Isaiah was actually a combination of a lot of different things. Now, as you could probably tell, and this is my biggest problem, this was kind of my red pill moment when I started to look at this stuff more critically, when I started to textually critically look at textual criticism, was that I realized that none of this is based on archaeology. All of this is conjecture, right? So this is my main problem with this, is that they're saying all these things, and so you would imagine that they have found documentary evidence for this, right? That they have found Genesis 1 detached and apart from Genesis 2. Or that there's a part of the Deuteronomistic history that's completely missing. It's added much later, which is the idea that they'll teach you. None of that has been found to pan out archaeologically, right? And this is one of my biggest problems with this, is that this has been done. It started in the 1600s with Spinoza, continued into the 1700s, 1800s. Actually, funnily enough, it was done by a guy, Jean Ostrouc, who is a French doctor. And he did one of the first critical analysis of the Bible. And he's actually the one who came up with this approach. But he did this not as a not as a way of tearing it down. He actually did this to rebut Spinoza. And it's really funny that he did this as like a pro-Christian movement type thing. But actually, like, it turns out, it's ended up used against it. But one of the things to note is that he entitled his original hypothesis "Conjectures on the Original Documents that Moses Appears to Have Used in Composing the Book of Genesis, with remarks that support or throw light upon these conjectures." Right? So he believes that Moses had these and combined them. So he believes that Moses is actually like a redactor or an editor. That's what he kind of believed at the time. Which, as long as we're in the realm of possibility, is actually just as likely, I would say, as this, right? If that's even what happened at all, and Moses didn't just write it. So I think there's all sorts of interesting, alternate history you can go on. But the problem is, ultimately for me, is that this is just conjecture, right? This is his idea of what was going on, responding to Spinoza's idea and other people's ideas of what was going on, because none of them had this stuff. Now, I actually give them less of a problem because they were living in the 1700s when we didn't have a lot of the material that we do now. I think now there's way less of a like, they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I don't even think they were aware of the Leningrad Codex, which is like a medieval version of the Old Testament. There was actually, if you could imagine being in the 1700s and having a skeptical view, you could easily say, well, no, these books have been edited and changed and all sorts of things over the century, because you don't have the documentary history. But now we can go back to the time of Jesus with the Old Testament, and we realize there are really not significant changes, So I think that there's a problem there. And now that might change in the future, right? I could be blown out tomorrow if we end up discovering a massive treasure trove dating to the thousands BC where there is no Deuteronomy or something. That would be a real thing to think about, right? About the history of the text. But until that time, we have to just go with the fact that this is conjecture, and be open to the fact that that could happen. We could also find a treasure trove tomorrow that shows that Deuteronomy goes back 1,000 years, right? They find some document cave like they did with the Dead Sea Scrolls and in Israel, dating to the time of David or whatever, and all these things are there. That would just destroy a lot of scholarship right now. That'd be nuts if that happened. So all this is to say is that this is convincing and helpful. It convinced me, and it's also convincing and helpful when it talks about, like, there are these patterns and we shouldn't just ignore them, right? That we should look at, this might be the wrong explanation for why they're there, but they're there, and we should think about that, So moving on, New Testament. So this is the two source hypothesis. I was actually taught this as three source hypothesis. Or there's all different types of ways of talking about this, but this is called two source because this is talking about Matthew and Luke. So, and where they get their material from. So, as you can see here, there are sections of Matthew and Luke that quote from the Gospel of Mark verbatim. This is why there's actually a lot of disagreement about priority. And what I mean by priority is which gospel was written first. So there's Markan priority, Matthean priority, and Johannine priority. I don't know if Lucan priority exists. I've never heard of that one. But basically there's an argument that says Mark was the first written. No, Matthew was the first written. John was the first written. Now, John is usually considered its own category. So you have two categories of Gospels in the New Testament. You have John, and then you have the Synoptics. And Synoptic means same vision, right? So the Synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all follow a very similar pattern in Jesus' ministry the last year, with a few things from the earlier times. Like, for instance, Luke and Matthew both have birth narratives, which Mark and John don't have. But they follow a similar pattern and thus are considered synoptics. So here you can see how these two books are divided, and they also have word or very close words with another source, which we don't know of, which is called Q, which is the German for Quelle, which just means source. So, because remember, this was all done in the German Enlightenment period, or German scholarship of the 17 and really 1800s. So, and they have their own original material, and that's what's kind of marked off in the corners there. And so the general consensus among scholars is that Mark was the first book that was written, first gospel, and Matthew and Luke borrowed from that. Now, of course, with Luke, this isn't really a problem, and with Matthew it isn't either, because none of them claim to be the first gospel that's written, so it's not really a problem. But Luke here says, oh, well, I've looked at other things, so it would make sense that he would be borrowing and using material from Mark for his gospel. There is a lot of debate, right, about Matthew and Mark. So the reason that Matthew comes first is because the early church believed that Matthew was the older gospel and Mark is actually a shortening of it, right? And there are still people who believe this today, but that is why Matthew comes first. Generally, the consensus, again, when I say consensus, um, I hope you realize that this is a conjectural consensus. This is not uh, a completely documentorial, archaeologically proven consensus. Um, this is a just like, oh well, we've all agreed that this is the right thing. Um, Consensus that Mark is first. So Mark in priority is kind of the generic way that you're taught. That's what I was taught, because Mark leaves out a lot of material that the others have. It seems to have been written. Its Greek is actually a lot more simple than Matthew and Luke and John, which people would say, well, I believe, this type of thing. It has a low Christology. This is one of my biggest problems with New Testament studies, but it has a low Christology, so it doesn't view. This is the claim. I actually don't think Mark does this, but the claim is that Mark doesn't have the highest view of Jesus as Matthew, Luke, and John definitely do. So the idea is that it starts off that Jesus, yeah, he's the Messiah, he's the Son of God, but we're not really sure what that looks like, and then it becomes bigger with Matthew and Luke, and then with John, which is written later, it's all John talks about. And this plays into this idea, well, that miracles aren't real. Jesus isn't God, right? And so these ideals would take time to develop, and therefore Mark has to be written first because his has the least amount of this material as opposed to Matthew and Luke. And again, there's no reason to think that, other than to just say that that's kind of just what people in the Enlightenment period would have thought. Right, they would have been like, well, we know miracles don't happen. We're scientific rationalists, so we can just kind of throw out anything that claims to be bigger than what we can see before us, and then we can say, well, that material comes later, and the earlier stuff isn't. So the Q source, right? People actually proposed that this was a real document. These days, most people I'd imagine have probably forgotten or not done that. Most people would say this is just oral tradition that has been passed down. So that's what you would get with the Gospels, right? And of course, I would say that most scholars today would say that Matthew and Mark are not written by Matthew or Mark. Those are later names that are given. Luke and John both claim to be written by the person that's writing them. I think most people actually buy Luke as the author of Luke, but a lot of people would say, well, John is written actually by a community of people. It's not written by John himself. Again, I disagree with all of this, just to let you know. But that's what you were taught. Now, this is, again, very helpful for just historical reasons. I don't think there's a lot to doubt about all of this, other than to just point out that, again, this is conjecture. And so I want to get to my last point. And this is something I took from this book that I had in undergraduate. It's called Anatomy of the New Testament. I wonder how much I paid for this. It comes from Fortress Press, which is the ELCA's academic wing, so mainline church, right? Actually, Clifton Black, I didn't take a class with him. He's one of the authors here. He was one of the teachers of New Testament at Princeton, and a great guy. So not at all like a... this is not... When I say this stuff, it's never meant to be a slight. It's just meant to be disagreements. And I would honestly think that sit them down and talk about it, and this consensus that's approved becomes a lot more hazy. And you only realize this when you interact with scholars. If the main way that you pull things is just from, academic journals online or Wikipedia, you wouldn't really get the idea that there's as much difference here as possible. But I have in this book is this chart, so I took a picture of it, put it up here. It's hard to see, so I'm going to be zooming in. But here you can see that basically this has been broken up by the date, BCAD, the events that are happening, the Herods, so the people who were alive, the governors of Judea, and Roman emperors, and then when the New Testament writings were written. And there's other important things, right? So you have the conquest of Alexander, the Maccabean revolt, the Roman rule of Palestine. Really, it should be called Judea, but whatever. And significant post-testaments, this is what happens. Bar Kokhba, someone asked me about that yesterday in Bible study. I couldn't remember the name. Yeah, Son of the Star. He's like a guy who who fights, and that's the destruction of Jerusalem, and fall of Jerusalem, and all these other types of things. So, all right. So here we go. We have all these guys, right? Birth of Jesus, before 4 BC, and we have Augustus, 27 BC to AD 14. He ruled for a long time. That doesn't seem like a lot, but if you actually do the dates, it's like 40 years or something. So, long time for Augustus to reign. So what we're not going to focus on is you just see here, right? We have the crucifixion of Jesus around the AD 30. We have all these different rulers and people like that. Paul's missionary journey in the late 40s, Paul's conversion, and again in the 30s. So what I want to focus on actually is I want to focus on when things were written. So we have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians being written in the 50 AD. We have Philippians and Philemon being written in 60s, late 60s. We have Mark it being written in 70, right? They have it marked right at 70. So again, that's the mark in priority. It's the first gospel. Something you'll note also, Paul dies in the late 60s, and you're going to see that a lot of Pauline letters begin to appear here. So we have, in Romans. Romans is written in the late 50s, early 60s. So we have Colossians and Ephesians. Again, so what you would be taught is that Paul didn't write those. A lot of this, has to do with language, saying that Paul can't have written them because the language isn't Pauline. Or, in the case of Colossians, it's too Pauline, which I find ridiculous, but whatever. So you have the late 70s, early 80s, and you'll have here the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which is when they have Mark's gospel being written. Matthew in 80s, 1 Peter in the 80s, Luke in the 80s, and Acts, so this is like 80s, 90s, early. Gospel of John is in the 90s. The letters of John is in the 90s. The Revelation of John is in the 90s. The pastoral letters, that would be like all the letters at the end that are written to people like Titus and stuff like that, all being written in the 90s. James and Jude, you have late, right? So they would say that James and Jude is written in the late 90s, early 100s. And 2 Peter is written in the hundreds. So that's what you would be taught, right? Now, this has some problems, right? For Christians, if you're just taught this, because the fact is that apparently Paul was writing letters long after he died, right? And so they would argue that Paul didn't write those letters. You'll have it called Deutero-Paul or Pseudo-Paul, someone writing in his name, but not actually him. And of course, you have the Gospel of John being dated last, and that to me is... Again, now, if you just see this and you go, man, scholars teach this, Pastor George doesn't say that, is he hiding things from me? No. I disagree with them, okay? I don't think they're right. That's why I don't talk about this stuff, right? And, I mean, I do talk about it, but I don't, devote time in my sermons or in, teaching Bible school to kids talking about this stuff. I do want to teach a class downstairs about that sometime in our Christian ed. So we can get into this in more depth. But, it's not because I have never heard this before or because I know it and I'm worried that if you guys find out, you're not going to be Christian anymore. Because I think if you actually look at this, there's some serious problems. Namely, the Gospel of John. So here's a big problem for scholars with the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is said to be the latest that's dated because it has a very high Christology. What this means is that it views Jesus as the Son of God. And scholars have decided, again, without any sort of bias, right? No bias at all, that this can't be right because Jesus isn't the Son of God, right? That's what Christians claim, but, we as secular people, we know that he's not. One of the problems with this is that people assume a secular perspective is the right one for all this stuff, as though it has no baggage or has nothing to prove. Wrong, right? It is in secular people's interest to say that the Gospel of John isn't true, right? Why is it in their best interest? Because if it is right, then they're wrong. The same way it's in my best interest to say that the Gospel of John is early, right? Because I am a Christian. I want to say that John wrote it. I want to say that he wrote it early. I want to say that this is not a later development or an accretion, right? So we have bias. Now, here's why I think mine is actually better. or at least more honest to this situation. We're supposed to believe that John is the latest gospel, but the problem is that the documentary and archaeological evidence doesn't bear that out. So if we were to just not assume, because again, we actually don't have any of copies of these letters, just to let you know, from the 1st century, as far as I can tell. All of it's from the 2nd century. The earliest gospel fragment we have of any gospel is from the Gospel of John in the 100s, right? So we have Gospel of John early, before we have any copies of Matthew or Mark or Luke. We have the Gospel of John. So if you actually just did archaeological evidence, you'd have to date the Gospel of John earlier, because we actually have more of it being spread around and being preserved. Now, I don't think that is entirely like a foolproof argument, but that at least should cause like, wait. You know, we actually do have some of this, and I would say that scholars hide this information. I don't think they hide it. Again, I don't think there's actually nefarious things going on here. I think it's just bias. I think people just hold up the information that's good. Here's another important thing about John. John is actually very succinct and good when it comes to geographic location and giving details about places that has been confirmed millennia later, more than millennia later, through archaeology. So one of the best examples of this is in the Pool of Bethsaida, which I actually think is in John 5. Let me see if this is here. Yes, this is awesome. I didn't even plan this. So John 5:1. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. So in that, right, John mentions that there's this pool near this gate, and it's called Bethesda, and there's 5 covered colonnades. Would you believe we're doing excavations of Jerusalem, and we find that pool with its 5 covered colonnades? So John, again, if this is supposed to be written much later, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after all this stuff, is aware of this very intricate thing, which we didn't find. So actually, this was one of the things that was doubted about the Gospel of John. Originally, it was believed that it wasn't written by someone who had actually been to Jerusalem, because he messes up this, right? That this must have been a story that he heard, and this is well, guess what? It actually turned out to be true. So this was something that he knew about. He also uses place names and geographic locations that were very well known in that region, but outside of it weren't, and actually aren't present in some of the other Gospels. And the reason I think that isn't because I think the other Gospels are wrong. It's because they're writing to audiences that live outside of those places and to those places. But John is writing this as a kind of an eyewitness thing, which is a big part of his Gospel, right? He's like, I've seen it. So I think he's very focused on that aspect. Not that the other Gospels, by the way, aren't. Luke is definitely writing to a Gentile audience. This is the good part of biblical scholarship, is trying to find out audience by the use of language that they use, right? And that they do great jobs with that, I think. So we can tell that Luke uses this because he actually explains things, or will translate some of the Aramaic a lot more, or will call things by like their more Greek or Roman name versus the Aramaic name. So all of that is to show, like, we can't do a huge deep dive. So I want to point out that this stuff exists, right? That if you were to run into someone talking about biblical criticism, that you wouldn't actually be completely unaware if you watch this video of that. But you'd also understand that there's a bias that comes in with scholarship, and people who are often cited in this field, or people in the academy, are not unbiased. They have their bias. They absolutely do, as everyone does, and they will date things or say things based on their preconceived notions of how the world works, rather than looking at evidence. This is why archaeology, like I had that question about archaeology before, it's been such a boon to biblical studies and the case for the Bible, because so much of things in it were just disregarded as fantasy, and have now become proven through archaeological evidence, which I think has been preserved by God just to do this sort of material. So I hope this has been interesting to you. It's different, right? I'm not responding to everything, but I figured after those last 2 videos, I would do that. And so yeah, I would do something different. And I didn't want to do a massive video response, so this is pretty good. All right, you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you on Sunday for worship for True Reformation Sunday. Peace out.